thank you for tuning in. This is actually a fourth section of the CCG 8th China and Globalization Forum, and actually followed the dialogue with former Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson this morning, and Ambassador Roundtable this morning too, and China-European Roundtable this afternoon. So I hope you all enjoy the forum discussion so far. You are now watching the forum special online program, History at a Turning Point, Pandemic, Ukraine, and the changing relation between China, Europe, and the United States. Dialogue with historian Niall Ferguson. I would like to introduce our speaker, Niall Ferguson, today. Professor Niall Ferguson is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and a Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, where he served for 12 years as the Lawrence Tisch Professor of History. He's the author of 16 books. Many of them are award-winning and international bestsellers. He has won numerous books, prizes, an accomplished biography. He's currently writing a life of Henry Kissinger, the first volume of which we published actually published in 2015, and also got a very critical acclaim as a Kissinger, 1923-1968. The Idealist, the book won the 26th Council of Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Book Award. So in 2011, his film Festival Prize for the Best Documentary. Professor Ferguson is the Philip Rohn Visiting Professor at the London School of Economics in 2010-11 and a Visiting Professor at the Tsinghua University School of Economics and Management 2016 to 2021. So a well-known professor around the world. He has received honorary degrees from University of Buckingham, Macquarie University of Australia, and University of Oslo, Chile. And he's trustee of the New York Historical Society and the London-based Center for Policy Studies. Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. With 2022, we have entered the third year of the COVID-19 pandemic that has prompted many to pronounce the end of globalization. Amongst Washington drive to decouple from China economically and technologically, the Ukraine conflict has produced a rupture in the global energy and food supply chains, as well as the European balance of power. So from the globalist elite at Davos to populists at the ballot box, people from all corners of the world are grappling with the key issues in a great power relation between China, America, and Europe, and global implications. So with the outcome of Russian invasion of Ukraine yet to come, how can we use history to help inform and illuminate the present and present the choices and the challenges facing the world? This program features Professor Niall Ferguson, one of the most brilliant historians of our age, and his insight on the key issues of the day. So without further ado, let's start with our esteemed speaker, who is to join us from London. Hi, Niall, how are you? Great to have you. So maybe you can have your opening remarks. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Henry. It's a pleasure to join this group. It's a critical time in history in so many different respects. I thought it might make sense just to reflect on the non-transitory nature of the crises we face. Transitory is a word that appeals to many people. It's usually mentioned in connection with inflation. When inflation leapt upwards this year, many economists argued, including economists at the Federal Reserve, that it was just transitory. And of course, that turned out to be very wrong. And the predictions that Larry Summers and others made last year that inflation was going to surge up to levels we haven't seen since the early 1980s proved to be right. inflation, in other words, turned out not to be transitory, and I don't think it's going to go away in the way that the central banks forecast. A lot of people thought the war in Ukraine would be transitory too. There were people who published articles at the beginning of the war in late February suggesting that it would be over very quickly because Russia would swiftly take control of Kyiv and overthrow the Ukrainian government. When that didn't happen, there were others who argued that Ukraine was going to win the war almost as quickly. And here we are. It's June and there is no end in sight. So that war turned out not to be transitory, and it's hard to know just when it will end. And finally, of course, there's COVID-19, the pandemic that has now been going for close to 2.5 years. And anybody who tells you that it's over and that we're in the post-pandemic era isn't looking at the data where new variants continue to manifest themselves, and case numbers, hospitalization numbers, and death numbers are going up this very week in many countries. So I think the broad observation I would make is that in our time, we suffer from an attention deficit disorder. We want the news cycle to be 2 or 3 weeks, and then we get something new to think about. But history doesn't provide such short-lived events. And in each case, the economic shock, the geopolitical shock, and the public health shock, the event is lasting longer than people were expecting. And indeed, each of these problems, the problem of inflation, the problem of war, and the problem of the pandemic, don't actually seem likely, in my view, to stop anytime soon, and may indeed start to feel like permanent features of life over the coming years. So that's my introductory observation. But for the sake of dialogue, let me stop there and throw the ball back to you, Henry.
Thank you, Neil. Great for your opening remark. I mean, you are really such a great historian and has been watching the history unfolding in many aspects. And I also I read your recent articles in Bloomberg as well. But let's maybe still concentrate a bit on this pandemic. And as we know that your latest book, the Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe, argues that disasters are often consequences of man-made social and economic factors and of political decisions. You know that we are still come back to COVID-19, and of course, the worldwide, virus has claimed many lives. And so, what as a historian you look at this certainly in the long term. So, does the pandemic teach us in terms of international relations? I mean, in which ways the COVID-19 have changed the dynamic of global cooperation, and also the lessons we can draw from the past. So, and this is pandemic, but also on top of that, we we have this Ukraine war, we have this also energy crisis, we have this food crisis, and also the high inflation. I saw you also interviewed together with Larry Summers at Bloomberg. I mean, he talked about this inflation that has been really driving at all-time high. So I hope that you look at history, look at what can be unfold in the years to come, and also you mentioned about the Cold War in the past as well. So there are so many factors added up, and we are probably at the crossroads for the mankind. And how can we steer through this kind of a mad, chaotic situation? We need wisdom. We need to look at the history, and you probably can give us some hint on that.
I think the first thing to realize is that one thing leads to another, one crisis leads to another, sometimes to more than one other crisis. And this creates a kind of cascade or avalanche, which takes people by surprise. Many people, when the pandemic first began in early 2020, didn't appreciate the enormous economic consequences of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the lockdowns that were recommended by epidemiologists and public health experts. That huge economic shock in early 2020 then led to massive fiscal and monetary measures to offset the costs of lockdowns. But these in turn had the inflationary consequence by 2021 when vaccines became available and the need for drastic lockdowns, at least in the Western world, diminished. Of course, sometimes disasters are unrelated to one another. I don't think one could claim that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was connected in any way to the pandemic. The reality is that history in many ways is just one disaster after another, and you don't really have any way of predicting what disaster will strike next. Interestingly, many people prior to 2020 thought that the problem of pandemics had been solved. My old friend, the Harvard psychologist Steve Pinker, wrote in his book Enlightenment Now that there really wouldn't be another pandemic because we had got so good at medical science and at public health. And I felt strongly that that was too optimistic a view, and that there was going to be at some point a new kind of respiratory disease, a new kind of virus against which we wouldn't be well protected. Now, compared with the distant past, compared with, for example, the 14th century when the Black Death swept across the Eurasian landmass, we've made tremendous advances, not only in terms of medical science, but in terms of international cooperation between governments, between public health agencies. And much of that progress happened in the 19th and the 20th centuries. It was fitful. Of course, it was far from a perfect system, but the World Health Organization by the late 20th century certainly represented the best achievement in international public health cooperation in all of history. So the big question becomes, why did our system perform much worse than it should have when COVID-19 manifested itself in early 2020? And I don't think we have great answers to that question yet, partly because I don't think there's been a thorough inquiry into the origins of the pandemic, not only in China, but globally. We also don't have, I think, nearly enough of an inquiry into why national public health systems did badly. The American public health system was supposed to be the best prepared in the world for a pandemic, and it turned out to perform really poorly, with in excess of 1 million deaths attributable to COVID. So I think the puzzle of 2020 and 2021 is that our international systems and our national systems did much worse than one would have expected on the eve of the pandemic. And I think it's extremely important that around the world, we really do dig into the causes of this disaster, because clearly this isn't the last pandemic. There'll be, no doubt, in addition to new variants of COVID, there'll be some other form of infectious disease at some point in the foreseeable future. Because in the end, globalization, for all its benefits, created a vulnerability. And that vulnerability was that there had never been more international travel. There had never been such large volumes of people crossing borders at high speeds. And therefore, we were highly vulnerable to any new infectious disease. That, I think, is the big lesson.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, absolutely. I think that how the human beings can work together and really internationally with this dynamic of the flow of the people, unprecedented flow of people, travelers around the world. I mean, this kind of a pandemic and future pandemic really has to be dealt internationally, collectively, with some multilateral a mechanism. That's absolutely important. Now we have the pandemic. I mean, you mentioned that it's really devastating, and also we don't know what's new coming up, and then we haven't found out what's really happened in the past. So we have to really cope for the future uncertainty. But then the world is really at a dangerous phase now. Now we are having this Ukraine Russian conflict going on. I mean, this is probably a man-made catastrophe, and also this has actually ushering a new era as well. Post and before we were totally different. So, what do you think about this? You call this historical energy. You have actually drawn in your recent article about 1970s, the avalanche of the history. The collapse of the history, and so in terms of this economic and geopolitical shocks that are happening, and it's actually made the world more dangerous. What is your take on the current situation, and what do you see the end of that? I mean, also now, even though Russia is confronting Ukraine, confronting probably indirectly NATO, but then we know that the U.S. government probably is really aiming at China in a larger context, and we see the recent visit of President Biden to Asia, and then set up the IPEF and also Quad and all the systems. So also I saw your article in the Bloomberg talk about Detente, that appeasement. Maybe we should probably look at the wisdom and what has been happened in the Cold War experience of 1950s and the 70s. What hasn't happened in the 1930s and what has happened in the 1970s? You draw a very interesting comparison there, and so maybe you can elaborate about your those ideas, and let Chinese viewers know what is your key message at the Bloomberg article, which is very, very interesting.
Well, I think it's important to try to begin by understanding what exactly is happening in Ukraine, because I think a good deal of confusion has arisen. I've been to Ukraine many times. I've visited the country almost every year for the last 10 years. And it's been obvious to me for some time that Ukraine was in a very vulnerable position for two reasons. Firstly, President Vladimir Putin clearly did not accept Ukraine's move westwards, not only with the discussion of potential NATO membership, but also the discussion of European Union membership. In his eyes, Ukraine was a historic part of the Russian Empire, and he consistently questioned the legitimacy of a Ukraine that effectively decoupled from Russia and became integrated into the West. That was why in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and sent forces into eastern Ukraine to help separatists establish control of Donetsk and Luhansk. It was in response to a political crisis in Ukraine when the then president Yanukovych turned away from the possibility of European negotiations and triggered a revolution, which in turn led to the Russian intervention. So this story goes back years, not just to 2014, but even further back to 2008, when the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine was first discussed. At the same time, I think it's clear that the West offered Ukraine the worst of both worlds. It offered the possibility of NATO membership, which clearly was regarded by Russia as unacceptable, but it didn't deliver on that promise. So Ukraine had the prospect of NATO membership, but never. And that was really, I thought, the worst possible combination And I agreed with Henry Kissinger when he argued in 2014 that it would be better to take NATO membership off the table and construct an alternative security arrangement for Ukraine on the basis of neutrality. Ultimately, I think the West failed to provide sufficient support for Ukraine in recent years to deter Russia from an invasion. There were significant arms shipments to Ukraine, but they fell away after 2018. And it seems to me that one of the lessons here is that if you're not capable of making a country like Ukraine well enough armed to deter an invasion, then an invasion is quite likely to happen. I think now the West, led by the United States, has committed itself to preventing Ukraine from losing the war, but it's not clear to me what exactly that looks like. We have now entered a new phase of the war. Russia failed to capture the capital, Kyiv, and is now engaged in a war of attrition in the Donbas region. But from where I'm sitting, it looks as if Russia is winning that war, partly because of the very heavy casualties that Ukraine is suffering in this artillery war of attrition. So I think there's a very urgent need to think of ways to end this conflict before Ukraine is permanently and seriously damaged as an economy. I don't think it can be in the interests of the Ukrainian people for this war to go on interminably. And unfortunately, there's every sign, at least from where I'm sitting, that the war can drag on through the summer and even into the autumn and winter, at which point Russia's leverage over the European countries grows because the full cost of sanctions, the full cost of cutting off Russian gas and oil from Europe will become apparent when winter comes. The last thing I want to focus on, though, is the role of China in this crisis, which I think is crucial in two ways. First, let me be clear. I can't believe that President Putin would have gone ahead without at least tacit, if not explicit, approval from the Chinese leadership. And this is an extremely unfortunate aspect of the crisis. The second point is that in response, the Biden administration seems to see the war in Ukraine primarily in terms of its relationship with China. There are clearly people in Washington who see their support for Ukraine as a signal to Beijing, see Ukraine in effect as a proxy in what I've called Cold War II. And the goal of US policy in the eyes of at least some members of the administration is to deter China from taking military action with respect to Taiwan. In my view, the strategy is a dangerous one in two ways. First of all, it's not clear to me that it works. Extending the war causes all kinds of disruption, including creating an inflation problem for the world. I don't think it really has a significant impact on the way the Chinese government thinks about the Taiwan question. Secondly, I think it's extremely dangerous for the United States and China to go down a collision course over the question of Taiwan. If this is Cold War II, which I believe it is, with China, as it were, taking the place of the Soviet Union, then the Ukraine war is equivalent to the Korean War in 1950. And the next stage in Cold War II would be an equivalent to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, in 1962, the world came extremely close to World War III over an island. And I think we would be running a very similar risk if there were a U.S. China confrontation over the island of Taiwan. So my argument is, let's learn a lesson from the first Cold War. And the lesson is that détente is better than confrontation. And I would argue that it would be preferable to fast forward and avoid the Cuban Missile Crisis in our time and go straight to détente, accelerate the Cold War cycle, as it were, and get more quickly to a period when the two superpowers focus on reducing tension, slowing down the arms race, and avoiding the kind of confrontation that would carry with it the risk of World War III. Apologies, Henry, that was a very long answer, but this is an extremely important point in my mind, and it's one that I'm trying my best to communicate, not only to people in Washington, but also, I hope, to people in Beijing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your analysis. I think you have given a very clear your perspective about how this Ukraine will come along, which I think there's a lot of valuable lessons to be learned, and also you analyze the current situation of what's the danger of that maybe leading to a Cold War. I have one disagreement is that I'm not sure that the Chinese leadership would probably know this beforehand, because at that time when President Biden and President Xi had a virtual summit, we had all the good words from President Biden, but the moment he went back, he said they're going to boycott the Beijing Olympic. And then suddenly Russian comes out, Putin said, okay, I'm coming, I'm going to support big way, and I'll be the major power to attend Beijing Olympic. So I think there's something reciprocal that China always have all kind of statement, friendship, memorandum, and so I don't think we were really aware, because Chinese, China was the last to pull out its Patriots from Kyiv. We're almost getting some people killed there. If they knew there was a serious attack like that, they would probably put them out the earliest. But other than that, I think your argument also make a lot of sense. That this actually is a Cold War coming up, and even though Russia is involved, there could be more targeted by the U.S., like what we see from recent U.S. administration. Also, Secretary Blinken speech lately that they have to invest, they have to alliance, and then they have to compete with China. So you see that kind of a framework that they are building right now. But you are right. You talk about Detente. That's really a great word. I mean, we should really revisit the wisdom of that. By President Reagan, who does that with Gorbachev, and now I think Biden probably in a very I mean, we don't see many times. There's a midterm election coming up. Democrats probably is facing a huge challenge, may lose both majorities, and also that this China tariff has contributed significantly to the the U.S. inflation. According to some think tank, it could be probably cost 2 to 3%. So this trade war doesn't really make sense. And you are right. Taiwan is really a hot spot probably if we're not careful. And as you said, the Cuba Missile Crisis almost lead us to the Third World War. So those historical lessons, you as a great historian, has reminded the people from East and West of all those dangerous outcome. And actually, you are the autobiography of Dr. Henry Kissinger, and he has said we are at the foothills of the Cold War. So how do you think we can really get out of this dangerous situation, or maybe a Cold War 2.0? And where do you see the China, U.S. and EU to some extent that we can really safeguard multilateral system, find a way to peacefully coexist. Of course, we have differences. We have values differences. We have a different running governance system. But let's not really get into a conflict. I saw recently Chinese defense minister answered 11 questions at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and also he met 6 counterparts in different countries. So we see some high-level dialogue now, and Chinese top diplomat Yang Jiechi also meet Jack Sullivan lately. So what do you see how China U.S. can really getting out of this very dangerous trend that as you are so familiar with the both situation, and also sitting in the UK to look at both sides?
Well, I think that the lesson of history is that, and this was an argument my old friend Graham Allison made several years ago, is that a rising power and an established power are quite likely to come into conflict. This is one of the patterns of history. And the interesting thing about the relationship between the US and China is that it went through a period of being relatively harmonious and cooperative, the era of what I call Chimerica. But then quite quickly, Chimerica, the partnership between the US and China, which was mainly economic in its nature, began to crumble and was replaced by something that looked and sounded a lot like a Cold War. Now, when I first made this argument in 2018, not everyone agreed, but this was partly because they'd forgotten the true nature of the first Cold War. The true nature of a Cold War, as George Orwell said in 1945, is that it is a peace that is no peace. There isn't an outright world war, but the two superpowers engage in all kinds of indirect conflict. The arms race was the most obvious example of the first Cold War, the nuclear arms race, but there was also a space race. A Cold War is a technological competition, but it's also an ideological competition. And then it has, in addition, classic territorial aspects where the two superpowers seek to have spheres of influence or reach far abroad in search of support. So if one compares Cold War I with our present situation, the truth is that we now have most of the characteristics of a Cold War. And I think it's important for both sides to recognize this. Part of what made the first Cold War dangerous was that there was no precedent. And I don't think people fully understood the risks that were being run in the early phase of the Cold War. The Korean War was a very risky moment. There were serious debates about whether nuclear weapons should be used against China by the United States. In the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a Soviet submarine came very close indeed to firing a nuclear torpedo at American naval vessels, which really would have triggered a world war. So the lesson of history is, when you're in a Cold War, it's good to recognize that and not be in denial about it. And it's also good to recognize that Cold War is better than World War III. The most important thing is to manage the relationship, manage the technological competition, manage the ideological competition to avoid escalation to outright world war. That's the critical lesson, I think, of the first Cold War. And if you ask how that was done, then I think you have to give some credit, indeed quite a lot of credit, to Henry Kissinger and the presidents that he served, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, who did a great deal to relax relations with the Soviet Union, and of course, began that process of building a diplomatic relationship between the United States and China, beginning with Kissinger's secret trip to Beijing in 1971 and Richard Nixon's visit to China 50 years ago. Now, from my vantage point, I would far rather that we tried to revive some of that spirit of détente, the term that was used in the 1970s, because it seems to me that the alternative is an increasingly competitive, combative, and ultimately conflict-oriented relationship, which will have more than one flashpoint. It's not just about Taiwan, it's also about the South China Sea. Listening to Antony Blinken's recent speech, almost every issue was mentioned in that speech, including Hong Kong and Xinjiang. The administration seems to be on a collision course. And unfortunately, one hears somewhat similar rhetoric from the Chinese side. My message to both sides is you really do not want to replay the Cuban Missile Crisis over Taiwan. Nobody would benefit from such a risky escalation. Far more important, I think, at this point, to seek a new era of détente and to revive the kind of communications, the kind of strategic dialogue that the US and China used to have. Let me add one more point. It's come as a great surprise to many people, including, I think, in China, that Joe Biden's administration has in some ways been more combative towards China than President Donald Trump's. Trump was interested in a trade war. He wasn't really interested in any other kind of war. And my sense is that if he'd been re-elected, we would probably have seen negotiations about the tariffs by now. Ironically, Joe Biden ran against Trump, partly arguing that he would be tougher on China than Trump. And he's followed through since being inaugurated by pursuing a policy that I think authentically is tougher. Why the Democratic Party wants to persist with Donald Trump's tariffs has never been clear to me, because they opposed them at the time that they were being imposed. So there's something a little odd here about the way in which the US administration is proceeding. And considering the inflation problem that the Biden administration faces, it would seem to me perfectly obvious that a smart step in the right direction would be to start discussing how to reduce the tariffs and bring to an end a trade war that, it must be said, did not achieve terribly much, even in its own terms.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. Actually, so you gave a very good analysis about this Cold War danger that we've been seeing more and more now. And you're right. I mean, many people in China felt that when President Biden comes up, and maybe we should have a little relax, since he's an old friend of President Xi, and the time, the many meals and meetings they had together. He understands China, and also all the previous visits he's been quite a number of times. But at the end, it seems that was not the case. I mean, he's even more systematically containing China, and also encroach China and encircle China and things like that. So that really made people wondering what's going on. And you mentioned about this history. Historical lessons. I mean, we probably really should visit the wisdom of Dr. Kissinger, President Nixon. You're right. This is the 50 years anniversary of Nixon visit to China, and we just, recently had another televised event about Kissinger's 99th birthday with Chinese and also American top diplomats and think tankers. So I think that can we have some realistic view? Because I think China and the U.S. being the number one and number two largest economy in the world has a moral responsibility. I've been discussing with Graham Allison a few times on similar dialogue, and Joseph Nye and many of Larry Summers. I mean, they all felt we shouldn't have a Cold War. Nobody wants decouple. They were saying, yeah, we have a, competition. We have also cooperation. That's competition, or cooperative rivalry. Use Graham's word. So can we, China, US, can we really get into that kind of situation? Because you mentioned about Chemika a few years ago. That was a very popular name. 300 million migrant workers married with 300 million consumers in the U.S. Let's put this intertwined ecosystem that really seems to carry it on forever. But then unfortunately things starting to change. So how can we really get back? Because the world is really facing all the difficulties, dangers. We're probably going to have a famine with all the food prices going up, and China's energy is 70% dependent on the import. I mean, with this oil price at all-time high. So we really want to see China and US get along, manageable. Admit their differences. There's some problems. Let's face it. But we shouldn't go to the extreme of really I'm going to contain everywhere, or I'm going to drive up the military budget of all the countries in the region and everywhere. So that's really concerning, because given how dangerous, how vulnerable the world we are facing now, we can't afford the U.S. and China not to work together. You are the historian, China, US so well. Need to subscribe something for us. I'd like to hear from you as well.
Well, I think one of the key lessons of Detente is that it takes two to tango. Both sides need to be ready to make concessions, or it's simply not going to be meaningful. by the late 1960s and early 1970s, the cost of the arms race was becoming a major problem for both sides. And indeed, it was a heavier burden for the Soviet Union with its relatively smaller economy. I think the United States and China each need to look long and hard in the mirror and ask, what exactly is it that we're trying to achieve here? I've already said why I think it's strange for the Biden administration to pursue such a hawkish policy towards China, particularly since part of it originated with the previous administration. I think at the same time, Xi Jinping and his colleagues in Beijing need to ask whether wolf warrior diplomacy was really the way to go in communicating China's views to the rest of the world. In my most recent book, Doom, I argued that much that Chinese diplomats said and did in 2020 was deeply unhelpful to China itself by alienating European and other countries. The tone of Chinese diplomacy became rather shrill in recent years, and I don't think that that was helpful. I think to state too forthrightly ambitions of geopolitical parity, if not dominance, helps in no way, because this only arouses the suspicions of Americans and others that China's aspiring to world domination. I don't think that that is the goal of the Chinese people, but it sometimes sounds like the goal of the Chinese government. There won't be an era of détente unless both sides dial back the rhetoric, dial back the slogans that we currently hear. As you suggested, they have all kinds of reasons to cooperate. Most people talk about climate change in this context, but that's only one of many things that the US and China need to cooperate over. Public health, we touched on earlier. One of the reasons that US-Chinese relations have deteriorated is mutual mistrust over the question of the origins of the COVID pandemic. And then we have the big economic questions. The less globalization, the more decoupling, the bigger the inflation problem. And nobody really wins from a world in which we drive inflation up towards double digits. You mentioned, Henry, the danger of famine in large parts of Africa as a result of the disruption caused by the war in Ukraine and the sanctions. It's in no way in the interests of the United States and China for the poorest part of the world to descend into the kind of instability that we've seen in the past. So it seems to me that there are eminent practical reasons why Washington and Beijing should be talking more. And the first step, I think, is to try to put aside the Cold War rhetoric and learn the language of détente again. And that's one reason that I'm motivated to write the second volume of my Henry Kissinger biography, to remind people that détente was not a naive policy. It was not that Richard Nixon deeply trusted and loved Leonid Brezhnev, nor for that matter did Henry Kissinger regard Zhou Enlai as his best friend. These relationships were based on an understanding of mutual interest. And I think that should be the basis of a new era of détente. As I said, it must be preferable for the two sides to talk about their common interests than for them to use high-flown rhetoric and armaments programs to move us down the road towards a confrontation over Taiwan. And let me remind those listening that when my good friends Robert Blackwell and Philip Zelikow studied the issue of what a conflict over Taiwan would look like in a recent paper for the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the obvious points that they made was this would be absolutely economically disastrous, quite apart from the disastrous military damage that would arise. So I think it must be the case that both sides need to change their attitudes before we get ourselves back into such a perilous situation as the world found itself in back in 1962 over Cuba.
Thanks, Neil. I think that is really a good advice. Let's really get together, talk about it, I think also probably pandemic has accelerated this kind of isolation, mistrust, and less communication dialogue. Hopefully, now we're going to have G20 later this year. I heard the Indonesian ambassador mention this morning that the G20 will probably will have very successful tendency. So we hope that this top leaders meeting would really reach something. And but you're right. I think every country has its own views, and sometimes how we can really get this third-party international organizations, multilateral system to really glue things together, glue countries together is really, we need to really upgrade and also reinforce the global system. I mean, the global governance is probably falling apart now, and after the war and famine and pandemic and all those crises. So the Chinese economy is also facing a lot of challenges with the COVID reoccurrence, and the U.S. is having this historical high, probably since 90s, the inflation, stagnation. We have so many headaches at home. That's not really busy with all the things outside. And so before we really think hard on this thing, one of the things I'm wondering all the time is that because China has a different system. China has a 5,000 years history and culture. They always practice some kind of collectivism. There's always seniority, family values, education, hardworking, and things like that. Whereas I think Western culture, there's a Renaissance, there's individualism, there's all those freedom has been highly emphasized. So you think that from historical point of view, can different values, different system, in the end they can somehow really at least not converge, but at least they are peacefully coexisted. I was talking to Joseph Nye. He telling me maybe by 2035 or another 2040, we're okay. China is China. I mean, is a fact. We have to accept. If China is lifting 800 million people, representing 70% of global reduction, if China is also contribute over 1/3 of global GDP growth, become the largest trading nation with 130 countries, somehow, even though China have a little different system, can the West in the end accept that? And or maybe we find a way to, recognize each other, not just as a country, but maybe the way of life and the way of governance. So there's a bit of more philosophical question there, maybe to ask you in the end, I hope.
Well, I think the lesson of the first Cold War is that in order for there to be détente, there has to be a kind of mutual tolerance of difference in domestic political institutions. That there shouldn't be an aspiration on one side to make the entire world in its own image. Ultimately, each side thinks it has a superior system or it has the appropriate system for its own conditions. I think that's the starting point for détente. One focuses on the international interests and leaves domestic politics pretty much off the table. The only reason that you end up with arguments about domestic politics, I think, is if one side believes that the other side is engaged in espionage or other activities that, in fact, intrude into the domestic politics, into the realm of its adversary. So I think there's a fairly clear way forward. I don't think it's likely that Americans will stop criticizing the ways in which Hong Kong's new national security law operates, or the ways in which the Uyghur population is treated in Xinjiang. I'm sure we'll continue to disagree about the status of Taiwan. Those things, I think, are not going to change. But it seems to me we could learn from 1972 how to agree to disagree. That was the essence of how Kissinger and Zhou Enlai dealt with the problem of Taiwan, ushering in half a century of what became known as strategic ambiguity. It seems to me one of the worst ideas of the last few years in the United States was to get rid of strategic ambiguity. And when Richard Haass first suggested that in 2020, I was quite shocked, because it seems to me it's worked pretty well. Why change something that has stood the test of 5 decades? Philosophically, I think each of the two superpowers has a completely different approach to politics, which is historically based. We should accept that each system has its problems. Nobody could pretend that American democracy has worked with perfect smoothness in the last few years, but nor could anybody claim that the Chinese Communist Party has done an awesome and perfect job of governance in China. Both countries have problems. In the United States, we have the highest inflation since 1982. In China, the lowest growth really since the 1970s. So I think both sides have reasons to be conscious of their own shortcomings. Nobody can claim to be perfect in this debate. But as I said, the most important thing in foreign relations is not to criticize the domestic politics of the other side. The most important thing is to find common ground on those international, those global issues that are most urgently needing to be addressed. And I've already mentioned the key ones. Normally people put climate change first. Somebody might put public health first. But in my view, the one obvious lesson of the war in Ukraine is that war is the biggest disaster. War is the disaster you want to avoid. That's the thing that shortens lives most ruthlessly and causes the worst damage and disruption. So the top priority for U.S.-China relations has to be, face it, we're in a Cold War. Let's make sure it doesn't turn into World War III. And there are some extremely important lessons we can learn from the era of Detente in that regard.
Yes, that's a great message there. I think Detente would be really good to revisit, particularly the wisdom of Dr. Henry Kissinger and President Nixon, as also we are celebrating the 50 years anniversary of Nixon's visit to China. But maybe finally, as a second time you're writing the autobiography for Dr. Henry Kissinger. I mean, he's a brilliant figure in the 20th and 21st century. We saw him just celebrate his 99th birthday. Incredible. He's so clear-minded. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about how you go about this book and what can we expect, and why is your book coming out? And we can do I'm sure it will be a bestseller in China by then. And so maybe you can disclose a little bit what we are working on and what we can expect.
Well, I'm writing it now. I've written the introduction in 4 chapters. That probably means I've got about 16 or so more chapters to write. So I have a lot of work still to do. I hope very much that I can get the book finished for his centenary, for his 100th birthday next year, and have it published soon after that. Needless to say, this volume contains the critical events that we've been talking about, in particular, the opening to China and Richard Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972. So I think from the point of view of U.S.-China relations, it really repays a return to the primary sources. I'm working my way through tens of thousands of documents from the period, trying to piece together the origins of the improved relations with between the United States and China. And I'm hoping that the publication of the book will remind people of just why it happened and how important it has been for the United States and China to have a relationship, to be in dialogue with one another. As I said, this is not about naivety. Dr. Kissinger never pretended, as some people believed, that China would magically turn into a Western-style democracy, and he's always understood the extraordinary power of history in shaping the political differences between nations. I'm hoping, therefore, to get this book out as soon as possible because I think it's urgently needed. We've forgotten, in all the upheaval of the pandemic, in the most recent upheaval caused by the war in Ukraine, we've actually forgotten the dangers of Cold War, the risk in any Cold War that it becomes a hot war. And that, I think, is the thing that I'm most struck by as I read the documents from the early 1970s. They saw, Dr. Kissinger and his colleagues saw clearly how catastrophic it would be if the US-Soviet relationship escalated into World War III. We've forgotten how catastrophic it would be if the US and China went to war. It would be as catastrophic in terms of the military and economic as well as the human damage that would be caused. So if I can do anything to remind people of how dangerous the downside is, then it will have been worthwhile to write this very lengthy and detailed biography.
Thank you, Neil. I think this is going to be a great book that we all expecting, and you're right. The wisdom of Dr. Kissinger, and he actually, so 50 years, some years ago, come to China and reopened the U.S.-China relation with President Nixon. Was change the world, change the destination of both countries, and to that matter, the whole, globally. And so I'm sure that your book will be serving as a very timely and very important reminder of how the world we are getting to another dangerous phase, and is Detente is really absolutely should be revisited, and wisdom of Nixon and Dr. Kissinger should be revalued as well. I mean, we are really needing this kind of people that still alive today had witnessed both century and has witnessed so many things happen, and you are doing such a great job in summarizing, analyzing, and also looking at history and predict the future. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot of food for thought out of your great talk with us. So Neil, I really appreciate you taking the time. We had a little technical problem at the beginning, but I apologize for that. But we had a very busy day. Today we had Henry Paulson in the morning. We had 20 ambassadors come to the CCG meeting room, and we have another China European Business Council, China EU Business Roundtable this afternoon, right before we start. So there's a bit of a catch up, but I'm really glad that we really worked out. And I'm Henry Huiyao Wang, the founder and president of Center for China and Globalization. I really appreciate Neil speaking with us. We actually talked, I was at London quite a number of years ago. We were at the same panel. You were just flying from US with your jet lag. I remember well, we shared the same stage with a British think tank. So that was really great. So any last word, and we'll close after your final word.
Very briefly, Henry, I think it's extremely important that we have conversations like this, and that through the unofficial channels of academia, we have a discussion about where the US-China relationship goes from here. It's seemed to me that in the last few years, there's been more and more conversation within the United States about China, or within China about the United States. In the end, we need to talk across the Pacific. We need to talk in ways like this. And I hope very much that it won't be too long before we can get off Zoom and be once again in the same room as one another, whether in Beijing or somewhere in the United States. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. It's an important one. And I congratulate you on putting together such an impressive program for this event. Thank you for making me part of it. And I look forward to our next encounter, hopefully in real space as well as real time.
Yeah, thank you. We really hope to welcome you here in China, in CCG. I hope that when G20 leaders starting to travel around, the whole world can be lifted from quarantine, probably of some degree. So that day will come soon. I really hope, and really appreciate your time, and look forward to see you again in Beijing. Thank you, Neil. I also thank very much our audience, our participant of the conference. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll see you next time.
Thank you.